Hello and welcome to a journey along a river that should not have birthed a kingdom. Imagine a land where stone burns beneath the sun, where rain rarely falls, and where the desert presses close enough to silence even the boldest wanderer. A land without the fertile deltas of the north, without endless forests or soft seas, without the natural abundance that nourished other ancient powers. By all common logic, such a place should never have supported great cities, let alone a dynasty that would one day claim the throne of Egypt itself. And yet, for more than 2,000 years, the people of Kush carved temples from the red earth, forged iron in forests of acacia, and thorn-raised black granite pyramids against the sky, and ruled as the Black Pharaohs of the Nile. This is the story of the Kingdom of Kush and the forgotten Nile civilization, the power, the art, and the enduring spirit of ancient Nubia. How did a land so often dismissed as a frontier become a crucible of kings? How did its warriors rise from the deep south to challenge the might of the Egyptian empire? How did its queens wield authority with a firmness that startled foreign scribes? How did its artists forge a visual language unlike any other along the Nile? In this saga, we will trace the birth of Kerma, the rise of Napata, the golden age of Meroë, the wars that reshaped the river, and the quiet brilliance of a civilization long overshadowed. But before we begin, let your breath settle as if dust were falling slowly through a shaft of morning light. Let the noise of the present dim to a faint hum. Let the mind loosen its grip on the now, because we are about to drift backward through river mist, through desert wind, through layers of time, until the waters of the ancient Nile flow beneath our feet, cool and heavy, with sediment whispering of a world that has not yet spoken its name. The land of the first cataract. The story of Kush begins not with crowns, but with the land itself. In the deep south, where the Nile narrows between granite cliffs, the river becomes something different, stronger, faster edged by raw stone. These rocky thresholds called the cataracts shaped everything that would come. Here the stakes were simple but immense. Life depended on mastering the river's moods. Floods could nourish the black silt banks, but they also tore away crops. Dry years brought famine. The cliffs limited travel, forcing traders and armies alike to move with caution. And yet amid these constraints, human communities found possibility. The people who lived here were pastoralists at first, guardians of cattle with long curved horns, tending herds across plains that burned gold under the sun. Over time, they built small towns whose remains still sleep under the desert crust. They traded ivory, incense, and stone. They crafted pottery with a delicacy that startled archaeologists thousands of years later, ceramics so thin and burnished that they seemed to pulse with the memory of hands long gone. But this was only the beginning. Kerma, the first Black Kingdom. The rise of Kerma is the first great turning point. The city of clay and shadow. Archaeologists describe Kerma as a city built on a balance between stone and sun-baked clay, a place of wide courtyards, tall walls, and houses shaped like crescents. Its central structure, the defufa, rose like a giant block of baked earth, heavy and solemn as a promise. Kerma was not a village, it was a capital. Its rulers commanded trade routes from the Sahara to the savannas. They controlled gold mines, livestock herds, and the movement of coveted luxury goods, ebony ostrich plumes, incense, resins gathered from distant lands. The stakes rose, power drew attention. Egypt to the north had already become a civilization of monumental ambition, and as Kerma grew stronger, the Egyptians saw not a neighbor, but a rival. The rivalry of two rivers. Kerma and Egypt were bound together by the Nile and separated by everything else. Egypt relied on order, bureaucracy, and the rhythm of the northern floodplains. Kerma's strength lay in mobility, warrior culture, and the fierce independence of pastoral clans. Each watched the other. Each wanted control of the trade routes between them. Each recognized the other's potential to dominate the Nile. Clashes became inevitable. Egyptian records speak of raids, battles, and campaigns aimed at subduing the southerners. Kushite burials, meanwhile, contain weapons, chariots, and riches that reveal successful resistance. But even conflict could not break the connection between the two powers. Trade continued, sometimes openly, sometimes through intermediaries. Ideas flowed. Artistic motifs crossed the border. The Nile carried influence both ways, and through it all, Kerma persisted, confident, resourceful, unbroken. But again, this was only the beginning. The fall of Kerma and the shadow of Egypt. The conqueror from the north around 1500 BCE. Egypt reached a peak of military ambition under the rulers of the new kingdom. Pharaohs like Thutmose Tham launched massive campaigns southward, determined to erase Kerma's independence once and for all. Fortresses rose, roads opened, garrisons spread. Kerma was conquered. Its royal district collapsed into ruins. Its elites were displaced or absorbed. For centuries afterward, Egypt ruled northern Nubia as a colonial province. The weight of occupation. But Egyptian control was not merely military. Temples were built in the Egyptian style. Hieroglyphs appeared on stelae and walls. Egyptian gods Amun, Horus, Isis found new homes in Nubian shrines. And yet Nubia did not dissolve. It absorbed, it adapted, it waited. Burial customs blended local and Egyptian forms. Artists carved images of pharaohs with unmistakably Nubian features. Priests honored Amun in ways subtly distinct from those in Thebes. The land learned from the conqueror, but it also remembered its own past. The seed beneath the sand. Foreign dominance often hides the early roots of a new power. Under the surface of Egyptian administration, a new Nubian identity was forming, one shaped by Egyptian religious prestige, local tradition, and memories of Kerma's old independence. This identity would one day rise in Napata cradle of the future Kushite kings. But for now, the story rests in quiet tension, colonized, pressured, watching gathering strength like a river behind stone. Because what slept beneath the occupation would soon reawaken. And this was only the beginning. The mountain that watched. Napata did not begin with a king. It began with a mountain. In the quiet centuries after Kerma's fall, when Egyptian governors ruled the Nile southward and foreign soldiers patrolled the trade roads, a single peak cast its long shadow over the land Jebel Barkal, the pure mountain. To the Egyptians it was the southern home of Amun, father of pharaohs. To the Nubians it was older still, a sacred sentinel standing against time. At its base, small communities tended fields, herded cattle, and worked simple crafts. But the deeper truth was already forming. This mountain would become the anchor of a new Nubian revival. It began slowly, like a breath drawn after years of silence. Families returned to ancestral lands, merchants reclaimed the river routes, local leaders quietly invested authority in their own priests rather than in distant Egyptian ones. And in the shadow of the holy peak, the idea of Kush began to stir once more, a new Kush forged through endurance rather than conquest. But this was only the beginning. The shrine of Amun and the first nobles, the house of wind and stone. At Jebel Barkal's foot stood a modest temple, nothing like the grand sanctuaries of Thebes, yet filled with something equally potent: conviction. The priests of Amun in Napata began to assume a role greater than their means. They recited hymns in a voice that did not echo Egyptian politics but Nubian memory. They shaped rituals that blended ancient Kerma traditions with the prestige of Egypt's state religion. A new spiritual center was forming, quiet but steadfast. The stakes rose again. The return of a local power. Across northern Nubia, local elites, who had once bowed to Egyptian viceroys, started to reclaim authority. Some were cattle lords with broad pasture lands. Some were commanders of small militias. Some were temple officials who oversaw offerings and festivals. They built tombs, they adopted Egyptian artistic styles, but rendered them with local strength, broader shoulders, darker stone faces that looked unmistakably Nubian. No chronicler wrote their names, no royal cartouches proclaimed their lineage. But these were the men and women who nurtured the soil from which a dynasty would grow. A quiet revolution often begins with those who leave no biography, and their efforts set the stage for the rise of Kushite kingship. But this too was only the beginning. Alara, the first king in the silence, the man history barely remembers. Alara is a name found only in fragments, a ghost in inscriptions, a shadow behind later kings. And yet in the lineage of Kush, he stands as the first known ruler of the restored kingdom. His arrival marked a turning from cultural revival to political formation. The stakes sharpened. For the first time in centuries, Nubia had a single leader acknowledging neither Egyptian viceroys nor foreign authority. Alara's power was local, rooted in Napata, strengthened by the mountain's sacred prestige. He did not conquer Egypt. He did not build vast monuments, but his reign laid the ground for all who would come after him. Unifying the south, Alara's task was difficult. Clan rivalries had to be softened. Trade routes needed stability. The temples required restoration. Local loyalties needed to be woven into a single thread. This work was invisible to outsiders but essential. Civilizations rise not from dramatic victories but from decades of careful alignment. Alara's rule created that alignment. He strengthened the cult of Amun, elevating its priests. He married into powerful families. He extended influence along the river villages. He restored small shrines that Egypt had neglected. By the time he died, Napata was no longer a provincial outpost. It was a capital in spirit, awaiting a king bold enough to declare it openly to the world. And that king would come from Alara's own lineage. But this was only the beginning. Kashta, the boundary shifts. A king looks north. If Alara gave Kush its spine, Kashta gave it direction. He is the first Nubian ruler to move decisively northward toward the lands still under Egyptian control, not in open war but through a quiet assertion of authority. Egypt during Kashta's time was weakening, divided, fragmented, and struggling to maintain its old borders. Its governors in Nubia lacked coordination and often lacked loyalty. Kashta saw an opening. He extended influence into Upper Egypt through diplomacy, temple patronage, and strategic marriages. One inscription records him as King of Upper and Lower Egypt, a title surely symbolic at first, but astonishing in its implication. The frontier was shifting not by force, but by presence. The daughter who carried a kingdom. Kashta made a brilliant political move. He installed his daughter Amanirenas as the god's wife of Amun in Thebes. This was not merely a religious office. It was a position of immense economic, political, and spiritual weight, one that controlled temple wealth, land, and alliances. By placing his daughter in that role, Kashta effectively inserted Kushite blood into the heart of Upper Egyptian power. Egypt did not protest, it could not. The tide had turned. Kush was no longer a forgotten southern land. It was a rising force watching the north with growing confidence. But the king who would complete this movement was still waiting, a warrior, strategist, and visionary who would shock the ancient world. His name was Piye, and his arrival would change everything. The age of Piye begins, the quiet before the storm. Before Piye marched, he listened. Before he acted, he observed. He inherited not only Alara's foundation and Kashta's northward momentum, but a land united by shared identity and fortified by Egypt, meanwhile, had fractured into competing city-states. Local princes ruled like minor kings. The pharaoh's authority collapsed into ceremonial fragments. A divided Egypt was vulnerable. A unified Kush was patient. The stage was set. And as Piye prepared to take his first steps onto the world stage, the desert seemed to hold its breath. The temples along the Nile flickered with torchlight, anticipating the arrival of a southern king who claimed not merely land, but destiny. Because when Piye finally moved north, he would not march as a conqueror alone. He would march as the rightful heir of Amun, the god whose power flowed from Thebes, but whose sanctuary rested at Jebel Barkal. The Black Pharaohs were approaching, and this was only the beginning. The king who spoke to stone Piye did not crown himself with noise. He crowned himself with silence, the kind that settles over a man who believes his destiny is already written in the bones of the earth. At Napata, he stood before Jebel Barkal at dawn when the cliffs glowed red like living embers. The priests raised hymns to Amun, but Piye remained still listening. He believed the god's voice lived within the stone, whispering guidance that no scribe could record. Egypt was collapsing. The north was fractured. Its rulers fought each other like siblings, tearing at the remnants of an inheritance. And Piye, grounded in the mountain's shadow, waited for the moment when fate would open its gates. He did not seek war. He sought order, a restoration of the world's proper balance. In his view, Egypt had drifted from the will of the gods, and he alone, as the true son of Amun, could restore it. But understanding destiny did not lighten its weight. It only made each step heavier. This was the frame in which Piye began to rise. And it was only the beginning. The northern fracture cities at odds. By the 8th century BCE, Egypt had become a mosaic of quarreling princes. Tefnacht of Sais controlled part of the delta. Nimlot held Herakleopolis. Osokon ruled Leontopolis. And in Thebes, the priests of Amun struggled to maintain authority. Each faction built walls, armies, alliances, and suspicions. They taxed caravans, fought minor battles, and sent envoys who smiled while hiding daggers beneath their robes. Egypt was no empire now. It was a series of uneasy truces. And as the northern warlords jostled, a single truth became clear. None of them paid tribute to Thebes anymore, the city that had once anchored Egypt's spirit. This was heresy in Piye's eyes. For him, a king who ignored Amun was a ruler without legitimacy. And a Nile without its spiritual core was a river out of rhythm. The call from Thebes. It was the high priests of Amun who reached out first. They recognized Piye's growing influence. They remembered Kashta's daughter, Amanirenas, now installed in Thebes as a powerful figure. Most importantly, they saw that Piye's devotion was sincere, not political theater. So they sent a message: South Egypt is breaking. Come restore it. Piye did not reply immediately. He performed offerings. He fasted. He consulted omens and dreams. Only when signs aligned did he act slowly, deliberately, as if the march north had been planned by the gods long before he was born. But this was only the beginning, the march of the sacred army. The proclamation. Before Piye left Kush, he issued a decree unlike anything surviving from other African kings of the era. He commanded his soldiers, wash yourselves, purify your bodies, for you march not to conquer, but to restore. His campaign was not framed as war. It was framed as a ritual journey, a cleansing of the Nile from chaos. This proclamation, recorded on monumental stelae, reveals much about Piye's mind. He believed he was fulfilling divine duty. He saw the Nile as a single civilization, not two. He viewed the Egyptian princes as children who had strayed. He considered himself the elder, returning discipline to a fractured house. This was not arrogance, it was conviction. Crossing into Egypt. As the Kushite army advanced north, villages greeted them with offerings. Horses prized throughout Nubia carried archers who moved with startling precision. Piye's cavalry was among the finest in the ancient world, trained across open plains where speed was survival. The Egyptian princes underestimated this force. They believed Nubians were frontier people, skilled in cattle, not battle. But they were wrong. Kushite soldiers had inherited Kerma's warrior traditions, Egypt's military knowledge, and a harsh land that forged endurance like iron. The Nile saw their passage as a dark line moving steadily northward, leaving no disorder in its wake. And as Piye approached the cities that defied Thebes, the world held its breath. But this was only the beginning. The fall of Herakleopolis, the city that chose. Wrong. Herakleopolis was the first major city to test Piye's resolve. Nimlot, its ruler, had once allied with Thebes, but now hesitated. He fortified his walls, gathered his troops, and sent cautious messages to neighboring princes. He hoped Piye would bypass him. Piye did not. He camped outside the city, made offerings to Amun, and waited. He did not storm the gates. He did not threaten the inhabitants. Instead, he demanded a spiritual submission recognition of Amun's authority. Nimlot faltered. The capitulation. When Heracleopolis finally opened its gates, Piye did something unexpected. He walked in quietly. He inspected the temples. He spoke to the priests. He accepted offerings. He allowed Nimlot to keep his position under Kushite oversight. Not a single stone was burned. Not a single home looted. For Piye, conquest was not about destruction. It was about alignment. But the other princes did not learn from Heracleopolis's example. They thought Piye would be easy to resist. They were wrong. This was only the beginning. The siege of Memphis. The heart of the north. Memphis was the true test, the ancient capital of Egypt, guardian of the delta seat of kings since the earliest dynasties. Tefnakht, the ambitious prince of Sais, had established a coalition of northern rulers to resist Piye's advance. He fortified Memphis with thick walls and stationed archers on every tower. He believed the Kushites would hesitate. They did not. The storming of the city. According to Piye's victory, Stella, the attack on Memphis was relentless. Kushite soldiers crossed canals on makeshift bridges. Archers rained arrows from the western bank. Infantry surged through breached walls. The city shook with the clash of bronze and the shouts of defenders. When Memphis fell, the psychological impact was enormous. For more than a millennium, this city had symbolized Egypt's unity. Now it belonged to the king from the south, the submission of the north. After Memphis fell, the remaining princes submitted one by one. Tefnakht fled, then sent a letter acknowledging Piye's authority, though he refused to kneel in person. Piye accepted the letter with calm dignity. He had not come for vengeance. He had come for legitimacy, and he had won it. Standing in the great temples of Memphis, Piye performed rituals that connected him to the earliest pharaohs. The priests recorded him as rightful king, a title no Nubian ruler had ever held before. A new era had begun, but even this was only the beginning, the return to Napata. The king who did not stay. Most conquerors seize the cities they take. Piye did the opposite. After securing loyalty from Egypt's princes, he returned home to Napata, to Jebel Barkal, to the mountain he believed was the true throne of kingship. He left Egypt in the hands of local rulers loyal, but watched. He did not transform it into a Kushite province. He did not move his capital north. His power did not need proximity. It needed sanctity. For Piye, the kingdom's heart was not the wealth of the delta, but the purity of the mountain where gods spoke through stone. A dynasty begins. When Piye returned to Napata, he brought with him tribute from Egyptian cities, priests sworn to Amun, records of his victory carved in monumental stelae, horses, grain artisans, and sacred objects, the acknowledgement of Egypt's ancient temples. But his greatest legacy was invisible. He had proven that Nubia was not a frontier. It was a center, a place where kings could rise and shape the fate of the Nile. His descendants would follow his path, some with wisdom, some with ambition, one with legendary courage. And the king who would shine brightest among them was his son, a man named Taharqa. But his story, vast, tragic, and magnificent, was only beginning, the child of two worlds. Taharqa was born into a Nile divided one river with two destinies. To the south lay Napata, the sanctified heart of Kush, guarded by Jebel Barkal and bound to the god Amun with unbroken devotion. To the north stretched Egypt, fractured but magnificent, its temples fading its grandeur, bruised by centuries of internal conflict. Taharqa's childhood unfolded between these poles. He grew up hearing priests chant in the shadow of the pure mountain. He learned statecraft from nobles who remembered Kerma's ruins and Piye's victories. He absorbed Egyptian ritual alongside Nubian tradition. But most of all, he inherited a conviction that Kushite kingship was no longer confined to the south. His father had opened a door that could not be closed. The Nile was one river, and Taharqa believed it required one protector. Destiny approached him not as a thunderclap, but as a steady rhythmic drumbeat rising from the earth. The making of a king. The tutelage of Amun. As a young man, Taharqa spent time in both Napata and Thebes, splitting his life between two sacred centers. In Napata, he walked barefoot around Jebel Barkal at dawn, breathing in the desert cold before sunrise. Priests taught him the hymns that linked kingship to divine favor, insisting that the ruler's body was an extension of Amun's will. In Thebes, he witnessed Egypt's lingering majesty, columns rising like forests of stone, processions of priests shimmering in gold, carved hymns that echoed through courtyards at dusk. The weight of ritual older than memory, these experiences shaped him. They gave him a sense of inheritance that transcended borders. He was not learning to rule one land, he was learning to protect a civilization, rise amid ruins. When Taharqa reached adulthood, Egypt was still vulnerable. The princes Piye had subdued, held their positions, but unity remained tenuous. Each city balanced its loyalty between fear and pragmatism. Taharqa watched in silence. He had inherited Piye's legacy, Kashta's strategic brilliance, Napata's spiritual authority, Egypt's fragmented throne. He waited for the moment when the Nile would call him. And soon it did. The crown of two lands, ascension in Thebes. When Taharqa finally became king, he was crowned not only in Napata but also in Thebes, a dual recognition that marked him as heir of both Kushite tradition and Egyptian royalty. Few rulers in antiquity experienced such a fusion. In Thebes, the priests affirmed him as the chosen of Amun. In Napata, the mountain confirmed him in its silent ancient way. His authority flowed from two thrones, but his loyalty belonged to one vision, a unified Nile. The reformer king Taharqa began his reign with acts of restoration. He rebuilt temples devastated by past conflicts. He funded irrigation canals that nourished farms. He commissioned great statues and granite sphinxes. He revived festivals that had fallen into neglect. He strengthened trade routes linking Nubia to the Mediterranean. His building projects stretched from Karnak to Kawa, from Memphis to Napata. Scribes recorded his generosity. Craftsmen carved his name into walls with admiration. To ordinary people, farmers, fishermen, artisans, Taharqa was not an invader. He was a restorer. He brought order where chaos had ruled. He brought prosperity where famine had threatened. He brought reverence where neglect had taken root. And yet even at the height of his power, Taharqa sensed a distant tremor, a storm gathering beyond the horizon. But this was only the beginning, the shadow of Assyria. The empire in the east, Assyria. A rising titan of the Near East was expanding with relentless force. Its kings commanded armies that moved like iron storms, crushing cities from the Levant to Mesopotamia. Siege weapons thundered at their command. Armored infantry marched beneath banners dyed in fierce reds and blacks. Assyria feared no rival, but it watched Egypt and its new Kushite rulers with calculating interest. Taharqa understood this. He had read the signs. He knew that sooner or later the winds from the east would sweep toward the Nile. Yet he did not retreat. He strengthened borders. He fortified key cities. He prepared diplomats and generals. He ruled with confidence but also with vigilance. The clash of ambitions, the Levant became the first battleground. Cities that once looked to Egypt for support now sought Kushite aid against Assyria. They appealed to Taharqa as protector of the ancient order, and he answered. For the first time, Kushite armies marched far beyond the Nile, attempting to hold ground in a region where empires clashed like storm fronts. At first, Taharqa had victories. He supplied troops to rebellious cities. He coordinated alliances. He gave the Levant hope. But Assyria was watching, and it did not forgive interference. But still, this was only the beginning. The lion stands alone. The Assyrian hammer falls Esarhaddon. The Assyrian king launched a campaign of staggering precision. His armies crossed deserts, mountains, and rivers with discipline that impressed even their enemies. Egypt under Kushite rule was their target. Taharqa prepared defenses. He waited in the fortified zones of the delta. He relied on veteran officers trained by years of Nubian warfare. The confrontation was inevitable. The battle for the Nile Assyrian armies struck like a surge of black thunder siege towers, iron-scaled infantry, archers with composite bows, cavalry hardened by Mesopotamian warfare. Taharqa's forces fought fiercely. They knew the terrain. They had Nubian agility and Egyptian discipline, but Assyria's assault was overwhelming. Memphis fell. Cities capitulated. The Nile trembled under the weight of foreign boots. Taharqa retreated south, not out of cowardice, but out of strategy. He refused to die in a single clash. He aimed to protect the heartland. He moved toward Upper Egypt, toward Thebes, toward Napata, if necessary. He preserved the dynasty even as the delta crumbled. The king who did not break Assyria claimed victory, but the story was not over. Taharqa returned after their withdrawal, retaking ground the Assyrians had left, guarded only by temporary officials. He restored his authority in Thebes and parts of Middle Egypt. He was battered, but not defeated. He was wounded, but unbroken. His resilience astonished even his enemies. But the storm would return harsher, darker, more relentless. Taharqa understood this. His patience deepened. His gaze shifted southward toward his heir, knowing the future of Kush would fall not on his own shoulders, but on the next king. And even as shadows lengthened across the Nile, the flame of Kushite identity burned unextinguished, because this too was only the beginning, a throne under siege. When Taharqa's strength began to wane, the throne of Kush did not pass into peaceful hands. It passed into a world where every direction held danger, where the Nile was no longer only a lifeline, but a battlefield stretching from the delta to the deserts beyond Napata. Taharqa had resisted the Assyrian wave with astonishing resilience, but even he understood that the storm gathering in the east would not subside until it had claimed Egypt entirely. His final years were shaped by constant pressure, political, military, spiritual. And so in this tightening ring of threats, the mantle of kingship fell to his chosen successor, Amun, the last Kushite ruler to sit upon the throne of Egypt. He inherited not a kingdom at peace, but a fault line between worlds. And this was only the beginning. The dream of the serpent, a vision in the night before. Amun acted, he dreamed. In the twilight hours, when desert winds quieted and the stars stood sharpened against the sky, he saw a serpent stretch across the two lands. Its coils wrapped both Upper and Lower Egypt, uniting them. Its tongue flickered toward the delta. Its eyes glowed with divine command. In the dream, the serpent did not speak. It simply was undeniable, sovereign, complete. When Amun awoke, he believed the message was clear. The gods still willed a unified Nile, and they willed him to restore it. Dreams had guided Kushite kings before, but this vision was different, vast, confident, uncompromising. It echoed the old ideals of Piye and Taharqa, but it also whispered something more fragile, a warning of the fleeting nature of power. Yet Amun did not hesitate. He marched north. This was only the beginning. The final push into the delta. The return of the southern kings. Amun's campaign began with momentum. Cities that had once obeyed Taharqa reopened their gates. Priests in Thebes welcomed him with hymns recalling Pi's glory. Even Memphis, bruised by war, acknowledged him. For a brief glimmering moment it seemed as though Kush might reclaim all Egypt. The Nile appeared unified. The temples sang with renewed order. The southern kings had returned. It was a fragile victory, but a real one. Amun performed rituals at Karnak, reaffirming ancient rites that had been disrupted by the Assyrian invasions. Scribes carved his name into walls with reverence. He was not merely continuing Taharqa's reign, He believed he was completing it. Assyria notices. But the Assyrians' relentless systematic unyielding were never truly gone. When news reached Nineveh that the Kushite king had restored authority in the south, the reaction was immediate. No hesitation, no diplomacy, no warning. A second Assyrian wave was unleashed, larger, harsher bent, not merely on subduing Egypt, but on erasing any chance of Kushite return. The storm was coming, but this was only the beginning. The second clash with Assyria, war without illusions. The Assyrian armies that advanced this time were different from those Taharqa had faced. They came with hardened veterans engineers, iron-scaled infantry, and siege machinery that turned city walls into temporary suggestions. Their strategy was clinical: secure the delta, occupy Memphis, eliminate Kushite influence in Upper Egypt, punish cities that had switched loyalty, send a message to all future rebels. Amun prepared to defend his reclaimed lands, but he did so without illusions. He knew the scale of the Assyrian machine, the fall of Memphis again. Once more, Memphis became the crucible of conflict. Once more, it stood between a Kushite dream and an Assyrian campaign. But this time, the battle was shorter. Assyrian commanders had learned from previous engagements. Their forces overwhelmed the city with decisive precision. Memphis fell. Amun's troops retreated southward. The Kushite hold on the delta shattered. The advance into Thebes. The real shock came when the Assyrians did the unthinkable. They continued past Memphis. They marched toward Thebes, the spiritual heart of Egypt, the sanctuary of Amun, the city that Piye and Taharqa and all Kushite rulers had treated with sacred reverence. Even the Egyptians themselves had never expected an enemy to strike so deeply. When the Assyrians entered, Thebes did not fight. It bowed, exhausted by decades of conflict, overwhelmed by forces it could not resist. Temples were plundered, wealth was seized, sacred objects carried away. For the first time in its history, Thebes suffered a humiliation that cut into its very identity. And for Kush, the message was clear: Egypt was no longer theirs. The gods had closed the northern gate, but this was not an end, not yet. The withdrawal to Napata. The long road. South Amun did not die in battle. He did not take his own life. He did not vanish into legend. He walked slowly, deliberately back to the land of his ancestors. Back to Napata. Back to Jebel Barkal. Back to the cradle of his dynasty. On that long journey through Upper Nubia, something profound shifted in Kushite identity. The northern dream, the dream of ruling both lands, slipped away like floodwaters, receding after a season of abundance. Yet what remained was neither collapse nor despair. What remained was continuity. A kingdom recentered. When Amun returned to Napata, the temples still stood. The mountain still cast its sacred shadow. The artisans still carved dark stone into regal forms. The cattle still roamed across golden plains. The river still flowed with the weight of millennia. Kush did not fall with the loss of Egypt. It transformed. It reclaimed its southern identity not as a defeated rival of Egypt, but as an independent power shaped by its own landscape, its own gods, its own heritage. The Kushite kings had lost a foreign throne, but they had regained their heartland. The end of the 25th dynasty, but not the end of Kush. Historians mark this moment as the close of the 25th dynasty, the era of the Black Pharaohs who ruled Egypt. But in Napata, life continued. Kings still reigned, temples expanded, cultural identity deepened, art flourished. The dream of Egypt had ended, but the story of Kush was far from over. For a new chapter was rising, one that would reach its golden age not in Napata, but farther south in a city of iron and fire, a city called Meroë. And this was only the beginning. The turning of the river. When Kush withdrew fully from Egypt, it did not collapse. Instead, it pivoted like a river shifting course after centuries of resistance. Napata remained the spiritual heart of the kingdom, but over time the rhythms of the Nile changed, political winds altered, trade patterns bent, and a new center of gravity pulled Kush southward toward a land of untapped strength. There the plains opened wide, their forests stretched beyond the horizon, their rich soil welcomed crops with abundant yield, their iron ore slept beneath gentle hills, a place untouched by Assyria's reach, a place energized by its own geography, a place ready to be forged into a new axis of power. This rising city was Meroë, and it would define Kush's future. And this was only the beginning. The Great Migration of Power. Why the capital moved scholars long debated why Kush shifted its political center from Napata to Meroë. The truth lies not in a sudden decision, but in slow, deliberate evolution. Several forces pulled Kush south. 1. Security. Napata lay closer to Egypt, vulnerable to the ambitions of foreign empires. Meroë, far to the south, stood guarded by distance and desert. 2. Resources. Meroë's region brimmed with iron ore, deposits, hardwood forests for smelting, and fertile lands for agriculture. 3. Trade. New caravan routes connected Meroë to Central African networks, rich with ivory, gold, ostrich plumes, and exotic animals. 4. Autonomy. In the south, Kush could rebuild without Egyptian interference or memory overshadowing identity. This transition did not happen overnight. It took generations. Kings moved their court gradually, not abruptly. The center of life followed the movement of the throne. Nobles, artisans, scribes, and merchants all shifted with it, leaving Napata with reverence, but recognizing Meroë as the future. A kingdom unbroken. Kush had lost Egypt, but it had gained something greater, a new chapter, free from the shadow of foreign thrones. It was here in Meroë that the kingdom entered its golden age. But this was only the beginning. The city of iron, the workshops of flame. If you sailed down the Nile and approached Meroë from the river, you would first see smoke-thin grey plumes rising into the sky from hundreds of furnaces. Meroë was the industrial heart of ancient Africa. Ironworkers stood before roaring fires, faces glowing orange as embers danced around them like frantic insects. Bellows hissed, anvils rang, molten ore spilled into molds that hardened into tools, weapons, and ceremonial objects. Meroë's iron was not simply a craft. It was a foundation of power. Iron axes cleared forests, iron plows turned soil, iron spearheads strengthened armies, iron trade goods enriched the kingdom. To the ancient world, Meroë was a marvel, a city whose economy hummed with the heat of furnaces that rarely slept. Forests that fed the flame. Meroë's success in ironworking depended on something abundant in the southern land's wood. Vast acacia and palm forests allowed smelters to produce charcoal on a scale unseen anywhere else along the Nile. Where Egypt relied on stone and imported timber, Meroë had a resource-rich hinterland that turned industry into empire. But even here, challenges emerged, for the more the furnaces burned, the more the forests receded. The land bore the marks of both prosperity and exhaustion. Still, in these centuries, the fires of Meroë seemed eternal. But this was only the beginning. Queens of the southern throne. The rise of the Kandakes. In Meroë, something remarkable happened. Royal women stepped into power with unprecedented authority. These queens were known as Kandakes, a title that would echo across centuries. Some ruled alongside kings, others in their own right. They commanded armies, they negotiated treaties, they commissioned temples and pyramids, they were carved in stone wearing crowns and holding scepters. Greek and Roman writers, astonished, often misunderstood them, sometimes calling them all Candace, thinking it was a single ruler. But in reality, this was a line of powerful queens whose political influence shaped Meroitic society. Their presence signaled something profound. Kush was not merely surviving, it was evolving. Queen Amanirenas, among the Kandakes, one would one day rise to legendary status. Her name was Amanirenas, and her clash with Rome would become one of the most dramatic episodes of Meroë's history. But her story belongs to another chapter. For now it is enough to know that Meroë's throne did not belong solely to kings. It was shared, it was balanced, it was enriched by voices Egypt and Assyria would never have allowed, and this was only the beginning. Desert pyramids and Meroitic, writing a new artistic identity. In the age of Meroë, Kushite art blossomed into forms that were neither Egyptian nor simply Nubian, but something wholly original. Pyramids with steep, narrow angles rose across the desert sands, elegant, sharp, disciplined. Inside chambers were carved with solar symbols, depictions of gods with lion features, scenes of kings embraced by divine mothers, inscriptions in the Meroitic script. The Meroitic writing system remains only partially deciphered today. Its letters flow with smooth curves and subtle geometry used on monuments, pottery, wooden tablets, and papyri. It represented a profound turning point. Kush had created a written language of its own, one that did not depend on Egyptian hieroglyphs. Temples of the southern kings. Meroë's temples honored gods both familiar and new Amun, who never faded. Apedamak, the lion-headed warrior god, Isis beloved across the Nile. Sebu Mika, guardian of thresholds. Local deities whose names survive only in fragments. Their architecture combined Egyptian influence with bold Nubian innovation, slender columns, wide courtyards, reliefs that celebrated both war and fertility. Each building was a declaration. Kush was not a legacy of Egypt. Kush was a civilization in its own right. But this too was only the beginning. The expansion of the southern kingdom trade. Across continents, Meroë became a crossroads of world's caravans from the Sahara, merchants from the Red Sea, hunters from Central Africa, envoys from the Mediterranean. They brought gold, incense, ivory, textiles, iron tools, exotic animals. In return, they carried Meroitic goods north and east, spreading the influence of the southern kingdom across Africa and beyond. Diplomacy and distance. Kush in this era was wise enough to avoid entanglement with distant empires. It watched the rise of Persia, the campaigns of Babylon, the march of Alexander the Great, but it did not reach out, nor did it seek confrontation. Meroë valued autonomy above conquest. Its strength came from controlled borders, not expanding ones. Its identity came from cultural synthesis, not military domination. This restraint allowed it to endure while other kingdoms burned. But challenges were coming from a direction Meroë could not ignore: the north. For a new empire was rising on the Mediterranean, ambitious, disciplined, and endlessly hungry. Rome. And its ambitions would soon collide with the Kandakes of Kush. But that is only the beginning. The empire at the horizon. By the 1st century BCE, the Mediterranean world trembled beneath a single banner. Rome, disciplined, relentless, and expanding with a hunger unmatched by any empire before it. Rome's soldiers marched from Britain to Syria, from Gaul to the deserts of Arabia. Its governors taxed distant lands. Its legions crushed rebellion with chilling efficiency. Far to the south, Kush watched. From Meroë's palaces and temples, envoys reported Roman activity in Egypt, the new masters of the Nile Delta. The old northern kingdom of Egypt was gone. Cleopatra had fallen. The Ptolemies were no more. Rome had arrived, and with it came a new kind of threat, not a fleeting invasion, but an empire that planned to stay. In the halls of Meroë, concern deepened, yet Kush did not fear. It waited, measured, and prepared. And this was only the beginning. Amanirenas, the lioness of Nubia, the Kandake, ascends. Among the queens of Kush, none would become as legendary as Amanirenas, a Kandake, whose presence commanded loyalty and reverence. She ruled alongside a king, but her voice carried the authority of a monarch in her own right. She led armies, issued decrees, and embodied the fierce independence of Meroë. Greek writers described her with awe, though they misunderstood much. They called her Candace, unable to grasp that this was a dynastic title, not a personal name. Her rule combined discipline with devotion, shrewdness with courage. She was as comfortable in ritual robes as in military armor. And when Rome crossed the southern frontier, she did not waver. A threat at the border. Rome had stationed a prefect in Egypt, the powerful Gaius Petronius, who treated Nubia not as a neighboring kingdom, but as a territory to discipline. Trade shifted, taxes rose. Roman patrols edged closer to Kushite lands. The borderlands grew uneasy. Farmers whispered warnings. Caravans saw foreign soldiers on routes once traveled freely. Amanirenas watched. Her patience was long, but not infinite. When Rome pushed too far, she responded with decisive force. And this was only the beginning. The Kushite offensive. The strike at Aswan. The first blow came not from Rome, but from Kush. Amanirenas and her son, Prince Akinidad, led Kushite armies northward with swiftness that caught Roman garrisons unprepared. They struck Sieni modern Aswan, the southern gateway to Egypt. They captured it. They seized statues, grain prisoners and weapons. Kushite archers renowned across Africa delivered volleys with deadly precision. Roman accounts later admitted this with grudging respect. The bold symbol in Sieni. The Kushites toppled a statue of Augustus, the first Roman emperor, and cut off its bronze head. They carried it south across deserts and plains all the way to Meroë. There they buried it beneath the entrance of a temple. Every person who walked into that sacred place stepped on the emperor's image, a permanent reminder of Kushite defiance. This was not merely war, it was a declaration. Rome had met a kingdom that did not bow. But this was only the beginning. The Roman counterstrike Petronius advances. When Petronius learned of the attack, he reacted with typical Roman precision. He gathered legions, he fortified the border, he marched south with overwhelming force. His objective was not merely retaliation, it was domination. The fall of Napata Kushite forces withdrew strategically, avoiding unnecessary losses. Petronius advanced deeper, eventually reaching Napata, the old sacred capital. He plundered parts of the city, burned structures, and took inhabitants captive. He believed this would break Kushite morale. But Petronius misunderstood the kingdom. Napata was holy, but it was no longer the seat of power. Meroë remained intact, its iron furnaces hot, its armies unbroken. Amanirenas refused to surrender. She gathered her forces behind natural defenses farther south. Rome had struck hard, but Kush still stood firm. This was only the beginning. The stalemate at the edge of empire's warfare in harsh lands. Petronius pushed southward again, but the terrain was against him. The land between Napata and Meroë was vast, dry, and punishing deadly for heavy Roman armor and rigid formations. Kushite archers ambushed supply lines. Scouts misdirected Roman messengers. Heat and distance drained the legions. Petronius realized he could not conquer a land that swallowed armies whole. He retreated north, fortifying a frontier near modern-day Qasr Ibrim. The negotiation Amanirenas did not pursue recklessly. Instead, she sent envoys. Rome expected submission. What it received was negotiation firm, assertive, and dignified. For 3 years, diplomatic exchanges continued between Meroë and Roman Egypt. Finally, Augustus approved a treaty. The terms astonished contemporary observers: no tribute from Kush. Rome abandoned territories it had seized. Borderlands were returned to Kushite control. Peace was established on equal footing. Rome, the empire that subdued nations from Spain to Syria, had made peace with Kush as an equal. Amanirenas had achieved what few rulers could, a negotiated peace with the most powerful empire in the world. Kush had not merely survived Rome, it had stood against it and prevailed. But this too was only the beginning. The Golden Peace. A century of stability. After the treaty, Kush entered a long era of stability. Trade flourished again. Border tensions eased, temples and palaces expanded. Iron production continued to grow. The Kandakes strengthened internal administration. Rome respected the treaty. It did not test Meroë again. For generations, the southern kingdom thrived in the shadow and the protection of its diplomatic victory. Meroë's artisans produced some of their finest work in this era: delicate jewelry of gold and carnelian, ceramics with elaborate painted patterns, statues carved from dark stone with serene eyes, pyramids that multiplied across the desert horizon. This was not a civilization in decline, this was its maturity. Kush had found balance between war and peace, between tradition and innovation, between its desert origins and its expanding southern connections. A civilization confident in itself. By the 1st century CE, Meroë was politically independent, economically vibrant, culturally distinct, diplomatically respected, spiritually rich. Its identity was no longer shaped by Egypt or defined by foreign rivals. It was entirely its own. But history moves in long waves, and even the strongest kingdoms cannot hold the tide forever. Far from the Nile, environmental shifts were beginning. Trade routes were changing, forests were thinning. The desert crept slowly toward fertile plains. A transformation was coming, not sudden, not violent, but steady, patient, and irreversible. And for the Kingdom of Kush, this too was only the beginning. The land begins to shift. For centuries, Meroë had flourished, a kingdom of iron temples and queens whose authority flowed as steadily as the Nile itself. But no civilization, however resilient, is immune to the quiet forces that reshape landscapes and destinies. The decline of Kush did not begin with an invasion or a sudden catastrophe. It began with environmental change so gradual that no single generation fully recognized it. The forest that once fed the iron furnaces had been cut for charcoal. The soil long cultivated began to lose its strength. Rain patterns shifted. Savanna crept into formerly lush lands. The desert edged closer, mile by patient mile. And with each passing decade, Meroë's economic foundation, iron production, grew more difficult to sustain. No enemy armies stood at the gates. No conqueror demanded tribute. But the land itself, once partner to the kingdom's prosperity, had begun to withdraw its generosity, and this was only the beginning. The burden of iron, the exhaustion of the furnace's iron, had once been the lifeblood of Meroë. Its production filled workshops with smoke, kept furnaces roaring, and shaped tools that built the kingdom's wealth. But ironworking requires vast amounts of charcoal, and charcoal requires wood, an almost endless supply of it. For generations the forests met this demand, but slowly the balance tilted. Trees took years to grow. Furnaces burned every day. The demand did not shrink. The land around Meroë thinned. Fuel had to be transported from farther distances. Production costs grew. Trade revenues began to falter. The very industry that had made Meroë powerful now placed a weight upon it that future rulers could not easily lift. Economic shifts. At the same time, global trade patterns evolved. New routes opened across the Red Sea. Roman merchants sought goods elsewhere. Caravans drifted toward rising powers in Arabia and Aksum. Meroë found itself slightly off the new commercial map, still active, still respected, but less central. A kingdom can survive enemies, it struggles to survive irrelevance. But this was only the beginning. The rise of Aksum, a new power to the east. Across the highlands of what is now Ethiopia and Eritrea, the kingdom of Aksum began its ascent. Aksum grew with astonishing speed. Strong rulers, fertile lands, access to the Red Sea, maritime trade with Rome, Arabia, and India, a new coinage economy, renewed expansionist ambition. Its sphere of influence extended across the Horn of Africa, touching caravan paths that had once flowed primarily toward Meroë. Aksum did not initially challenge Kush directly. The two kingdoms coexisted, traded, observed each other. But Aksum's rise subtly shifted the balance of regional power. The Red Sea, once distant from Kushite politics, now brimmed with states seeking dominance. A slow encroachment. Over time, Aksum's influence reached deeper into regions that had long been tied to Kushite culture. Diplomatic ties frayed, local chiefs shifted allegiances, border territories grew uncertain. Meroë, aging but proud, watched the horizon darken with a new kind of threat, one not of conquest, but of replacement. But even this was only the beginning, a changing cultural landscape. The Meroitic script endures, then fades. Meroitic writing had been one of Kush's greatest achievements, a script born from its own identity, neither borrowed nor imposed. It adorned temples, statues, pottery, and papyri. It recorded royal decrees and sacred hymns. It was the voice of a proud and independent civilization. But literacy requires institutions. It requires wealth, scribes, scholars. As the kingdom's resources tightened, these foundations weakened. By the later centuries, writing grew less common. Carved inscriptions grew shorter. Long texts became rare. The script did not vanish suddenly. It faded like a language whispered less each generation. The spiritual shift religion also experienced subtle transformation. Amun remained revered, and a pedamak still appeared on temple walls. But new influences entered the region. Arabian trade brought new ritual elements. Red Sea connections introduced foreign symbols. Local gods rose in prominence as political centralization weakened. Kushite spirituality did not collapse. It diversified and in doing so reflected a changing world. But the kingdom's cohesion faced a new test, and this was only the beginning. The south grows strong. The heartland moves again. As environmental pressures mounted and trade networks shifted, population gradually drifted farther south, closer to the rainier regions and fertile lands. New centers of life formed along the Blue Nile and into areas that had stronger connections to Central African cultures. This shift was not a rejection of Meroë. It was a return to ancestral patterns of migration following water, soil, and opportunity. But for the royal court, whose strength lay in Meroë's established structures, this change weakened internal unity. Regional autonomy. Local chiefs and priests gained more influence. Some regions acted increasingly independently. Others forged alliances outside Meroitic control. The kingdom did not fracture violently. It loosened a slow decentralization that mirrored its own past. Yet the royal lineage continued its authority, respected even as its power diminished. But forces beyond its borders were gathering, and the quiet decline of Kush was approaching its final turning point. The last pyramids, a desert crowned with stone. Even in its waning centuries, Meroë continued to build. Its pyramids multiplied, smaller and steeper than those of Egypt, but crafted with devotion and precision. They rose in clusters across the sands, burial chambers for kings, tombs for queens, resting places for nobles, silent sentinels carved against time. The sheer number of pyramids testified to a culture that valued continuity, dignity, and tradition, even as external pressures mounted. Travelers from distant lands marveled at them. Roman writers described them with fascination. Caravans carried stories of a kingdom of golden queens and fire-forged iron. But behind this outward magnificence, the kingdom's foundations continued to erode, quietly, inevitably. And soon change would no longer be gradual. A reckoning approached from the east, carried by a kingdom eager to become the next great power of the African world. The kingdom of Aksum had watched long enough, and for Kush this was only the beginning of the end. The shadow of Aksum lengthens. For centuries, Kush had endured storms: Egyptian conquest, Assyrian invasion, Roman aggression, and survived them all. But the force now rising from the eastern highlands was different. It was not an empire of the moment, nor a temporary challenger. It was Aksum, resilient, fertile, strategically connected, and driven by expanding ambition. Aksum's rulers controlled Red Sea ports that linked Africa to Arabia and India. Its merchants minted coins with royal faces and inscriptions. Its kings commanded armies hardened by mountain warfare. And Aksum's leaders, watching the gradual weakening of Meroë, saw opportunity. Kush, once the dominant power of the Middle Nile, now stood at the edge of a changing world. Yet even as Aksum strengthened, Meroë did not crumble. It resisted through endurance, tradition, and the continuity of its royal line. But the two kingdoms were drifting toward collision, and this was only the beginning. The question of trade. The redirection of caravan. Meroë's position had always depended on its control of caravan routes. Gold, ivory, iron, incense, these goods once flowed through its markets, enriching its nobles and strengthening the throne. But when Aksum's power grew along the Red Sea, trade shifted. Merchants found shorter maritime routes. Arabian states bypassed the Nile corridor. Roman buyers preferred Aksumite ports. Caravans turned east instead of north. Meroë remained connected but no longer central. Economic decline rarely arrives in a single blow. It creeps. Less revenue meant fewer palace projects. Fewer palace projects meant less work for artisans. Less work meant weakened loyalty. Weakened loyalty meant instability. The kingdom's foundation was thinning, not breaking, but eroding. A diplomatic chill, Aksum and Kush continued to trade indirectly. Envoys still passed between their courts. Gifts were exchanged, but beneath the surface tensions rose competition for borderlands, rivalry for trade dominance, cultural influence in overlapping regions, control of caravan tribes. The Nile and the highlands eyed one another with growing suspicion. But still the breaking point had not yet come. This was only the beginning. The final queens and kings of Kush, a dynasty in its twilight. In these centuries, Meroë's royal line produced rulers who maintained tradition with grace, even as challenges multiplied. They built temples, they erected pyramids, they maintained the rights of Amun, and the ancestral spirits. But each generation faced steeper obstacles. Resources dwindled, regional chiefs grew more autonomous, external pressures increased. The Kandakes' long pillars of authority played less prominent roles as politics shifted in unpredictable ways. King lists grew harder to reconstruct, inscriptions fewer, monuments simpler. A kingdom that once commanded both military power and economic might now leaned on tradition for legitimacy. And tradition alone could not stop the tide building beyond the eastern horizon. The Aksumite challenge. A new ambition. By the early 4th century, CE Aksum had become a major regional force, wealthy, confident, and increasingly aligned with new global currents. It expanded into the Red Sea. It influenced Arabian politics. It adopted Christianity under King Ezana. Aksum's rulers sought to control inland trade routes that still lingered under Kushite influence. Tensions grew along the borderlands near the Atbara and Blue Nile rivers. And somewhere between skirmishes and diplomacy, a line was crossed. Aksum moved from competition to confrontation. King Ezana's campaign. Ezana, ambitious, young, and eager to solidify Aksum's power, ordered a military expedition westward. Aksumite inscriptions record this campaign with stark, confident authority. He claims to have defeated the Noba and the Kasi, terms historians connect to groups within the shrinking Kushite sphere. Whether Ezana directly attacked Meroë itself remains debated. Archaeology suggests conflict in border regions, destruction in key settlements, a disruption of political centers, a sharp decline in population and activity shortly afterward. If Ezana did not destroy Meroë outright, he decisively undermined its authority. The blow was not theatrical, it was structural, dismantling the fragile systems that still held Kush together. The silent collapse. Kush did not fall in a single day. There was no dramatic sack recorded by foreign scribes. Instead, its end resembled the quiet extinguishing of a flame long struggling against the wind. After Ezana's campaign, temples ceased major construction, pyramids stopped rising, Meroitic writing faded from use, political unity dissolved, urban centers emptied, the royal line disappeared from the historical record. The capital fell silent. No chronicler wrote the final chapter, no inscription declared the last king. The story ended in the same way it had begun, quietly shaped by land, river, and time. But this was not truly an ending. It was a transition, the legacy beneath the sand pyramids that endure. Though the kingdom faded, its monuments remained sharp, elegant pyramids standing against desert winds refusing to vanish. Their stone faces caught the morning light. Their shadows traced the passing of centuries. Their presence reminded all travelers that a powerful civilization once ruled here. Today, more pyramids stand in Nubia than in Egypt. This alone testifies to Kushite endurance, a written language awaiting its voice. The Meroitic script, partly deciphered, still holds secrets. Each inscription is a fragment of a story waiting to be understood. One day, scholars may recover more of this lost literature, the hymns, decrees, and poems of a people who carved their identity into stone, yet did not preserve their endings. A civilization of connectors. Kush linked Central Africa and the Mediterranean, the Red Sea and the Sahara, Egyptian traditions and local innovation, African political structures and global trade. It was a crossroads long before the phrase globalization existed. Its influence lingers in art, motifs, metalworking traditions, religious patterns, regional identities in Sudan and beyond, a spirit that outlived the kingdom. Kush did not vanish. It transformed. The people of the Middle Nile continued to shape the region's history in new kingdoms, new cultures, and new identities that carried echoes of their ancient past. The fall of Meroë was not the death of a people. It was the quiet turning of a page. But before this saga ends, one more chapter remains, a return to where the story began, at the river, the mountain, the memory. For the Nile remembers every kingdom that has loved it, and the legacy of Kush flows still. The mountain and the silence. When the last kings of Meroë vanished from the historical record, the Nile did not mark their absence with lament. The desert did not bow, the forests did not whisper, the winds did not shift, the world simply continued. Yet beneath this stillness, memory gathered in the stones of ruined temples, in the broken stelae scattered across the sands, in the pyramids standing in silent rows, in the mountain that had witnessed the first ascent of Kushite kings. Jebel Barkal remained unmoved, unshaken, a solitary sentinel that had watched kingdoms rise and fade, that had heard the chants of priests and the cries of warriors, that had glowed red at dawn during Piye's coronation, and had cast long shadows across Napata's final days. The mountain held the story as a vessel holds water, quietly, patiently. For memory in the Nile Valley is not kept by words, it is kept by stone, by earth, by the slow persistence of landscape. And this was only the beginning of remembrance. The echo in the ruins, temples without priests. As centuries passed, travelers who approached the ruins of Meroë found temples half buried in sand. Columns leaned, reliefs weathered, walls cracked beneath the weight of time, but nothing was erased. Even in ruin, the artistry remained unmistakable. Queens wearing crowns shaped like sun discs, kings embraced by lion-headed gods, builders recorded in profile, hieroglyphs and Meroitic script mingling like two languages conversing across ages. Europeans who stumbled upon these ruins in later millennia did not understand them. Their maps called the land Ethiopia, Nubia, Ethiopia, names born of distance and confusion. But the ruins themselves needed no explanation. They spoke with the authority of endurance, pyramids of the southern desert. Far from Giza's monumental silhouettes, the pyramids of Kush stood clustered in tight formations, smaller, steeper, sharper. To the untrained eye, they might seem modest. To historians, they are revelations. Each pyramid is a chapter, a king, a queen, a noble laid to rest beneath stone angles that point toward eternity. Even broken, their geometry is confident. Even weathered, their presence is undiminished. These pyramids do not mourn, they testify. They stand not for a lost power, but for a civilization that carved its identity into form, layer by layer, block by block, until even time itself must work slowly to erase them. Yet time has not succeeded. And this was only the beginning of legacy. The river's long memory. A land of continuity. Unlike many ancient civilizations whose people disappeared with their kingdoms, the descendants of Kush did not vanish. They lived on in villages along the Nile, in the rhythms of agriculture and trade, in the patterns of pottery and metalwork, in the echoes of language and belief passed down through centuries of quiet change. The kingdom ended, the land remained inhabited, and the people, though adopting new identities, new religions, new rulers, never severed their deep connection to the river or to the desert that shaped their ancestors. a culture that adapted. Kushite heritage flowed into Nubian kingdoms of the Christian era, such as Nabatea Mercuria and Alodia, artistic motifs that reappeared in medieval churches, architectural forms that persisted in local sanctuaries, oral traditions that preserved fragments of older myths. Even the concept of a powerful queen, the Kandake, left traces in later societies, resurfacing in legends and folk stories. Heritage rarely ends abruptly. It changes form. Like the Nile during a flood, it spreads, settles, nourishes, and becomes part of a new landscape. The modern rediscovery, scholars and sandstorms. When archaeologists first began to uncover the remains of ancient Kush in the 19th and 20th centuries, the world was startled. A forgotten African empire, older than many European states, richer in some eras than Egypt, with its own writing system, its own pyramids, its own queens and kings, challenged long-held assumptions about Africa's ancient past. Excavations at Kerma revealed royal tombs and pottery of astonishing refinement. Napata yielded inscriptions of Piye and Taharqa and Amun. Naga uncovered temples dedicated to lion-headed gods. Meroë exposed iron furnaces, palace walls, and sprawling necropolises. Each discovery expanded the world's understanding of African antiquity. The silence of centuries began to break. Stories carved into the earth. Today, scholars continue to decipher Meroitic inscriptions. Each character translated, each phrase understood, is a step closer to hearing the voices of a civilization that refused to disappear. Satellite imaging reveals roads, temples, and ancient agricultural systems. Chemical analysis uncovers details about metallurgy and trade. Archaeology connects Kush to global networks from India to the Mediterranean. The kingdom, once dismissed as peripheral, is now recognized as essential, a major power whose influence still ripples across the cultural identity of Sudan and beyond. The legacy that endures more than a kingdom. Kush was not simply a rival of Egypt. It was not a footnote, not a shadow, not a forgotten realm. It was a civilization that rose independently, ruled confidently, created fearlessly. Its kings wore crowns of gold and granite. Its queens led armies and negotiated with emperors. Its artisans forged iron with mastery. Its priests carved stories in 2 languages. Its builders left pyramids that stand untouched by the passing of 3,000 years. A final reflection. The history of Kush is not only a tale of battles, trade routes, and dynasties. It is a meditation on resilience, on how a people can endure environmental shifts, foreign invasions, shifting trade winds, and the weight of time. It is a reminder that greatness may arise in places the world overlooks, that strength may take forms different from those preserved in dominant narratives, that cultures do not vanish, they transform. The river's final gift. In the end, the Nile remains the keeper of Kush. Its waters wash the stones of ancient cities. Its floods reveal buried walls and forgotten roads. Its flow binds present to past. For as long as the river moves, the memory of Kush will move with it quietly, steadily, like a current beneath the surface of history. The Black Pharaohs, the queens of Meroë, the artists of Kerma, the priests of Napata, the iron workers of the southern forests, their legacy endures in every ripple of the Nile. And so the saga closes where it began, at the water's edge, in the presence of stone, beneath a sky that has witnessed every triumph and every fall. For civilizations pass, but the river remembers,